is Mario Matos. I am on behalf of Lou, who is traveling. So, well, we are, needless to say that we are in complicated times, in a sort of roller coaster of tariffs. And this time is not interesting, like in Disney World or other places. And in turbulent time, institutions are sort of landmark, a sort of a structure that guide us. In this case, should be WTO, but WTO is not in jeopardy, but it has a question mark in many camps. So here we are in this webinar to discuss about this situation, and we have good moderator, good speaker, a good discussant. So I'm going to give the floor to the moderator, Jonathan Fried.
Mario, thank you. And we also have a good host and chair today as well. So thank you. Well, I am almost tempted to say welcome to this all-day discussion because there are so many very important and profound issues cutting across many lines here. We could devote more time than we have, but we'll try and be efficient. Let me set things up with just a couple of observations before welcoming our presenter. Having read and digested and studied the underlying document, the Hinrich Foundation's survey that was distributed to all of you with a link to a more extended version with a more detailed annex. In my mind, there are three basic issues that it highlights. First, and I don't think, Chuin Wei, we're going to spend much time on it, but the fact that you reached out to over 27,000 survey respondents draws out the reality of the patchwork of stakeholder engagement and consultations. The WTO doesn't have a single organized way of engaging with its clients and stakeholders beyond the governments themselves. There's a patchwork of engagement that doesn't really enjoy a consistent pattern. There are informal thematic sessions. Some of the committees, such as TBT and SPS, engage. You, of course, have the public forum. Built into the WTO agreements are some dictated consultations with the IMF and other international organizations, for example. And there's been some ad hoc engagement during COVID, for example, when the TRIPS Council had quite a bit of engagement to gather input. Trade facilitation agreement with the relevant industry and donor agencies. And of course, aid for trade involves others, but there isn't a parliamentary assembly. There isn't, as the OECD has, a business industry advisory committee or a labor advisory committee. So to some extent, the survey fills a huge gap, which is tremendously valuable, and we don't need to question, as the statisticians will, the accuracy or distribution of the survey respondents and so on. You highlighted that. The second issue, which really is the focus, is the substance of what needs reform, since we all, I think, take as a given the WTO cries out for modernization and reform. You in the survey chose 9 questions, but by your own admission, it's not an exhaustive list. We could spend lots of time identifying other questions to ask on industrial subsidies, on agriculture, the scope of the national security exception, and so on. And I no doubt will learn from you about your choices and what's in and what's out, and everyone on the call will have their own views of which among all these candidates, 9+ issues, are most deserving of most urgent attention. And then the third issue, which this session may provide a sound foundation for follow-up discussion, is, well, what do we do about it? And is there one or more means or mechanisms or forums that hold better prospect in the real world of beginning to galvanize some form of agreement? And to borrow from the study, whether plurilateral, regional, or truly multilateral, to get things moving, first in a non-negotiating setting, and then to actually engage. And here, Hinrich itself is a good example, because the history of many important negotiations can be traced to the thought leadership that's offered outside government that helped to socialize and galvanize forward-looking ideals. I can speak from personal experience that it actually took two major studies, one in the United States by the Council on Foreign Relations, and one in Canada that was government commissioned, a royal commission called the MacDonald Commission on the Future of the Canadian Economy, that actually mainstreamed the idea of free trade agreement, and other than the U.S.-Israel agreement, which preceded it, the Canada-U.S. FTA back in 1988 probably was the first significant modern comprehensive FTA that set an example for many others that followed. So we have three huge issues, two of which, the substance and what to do about it, will occupy our attention today. We're very honored to have Chuin Wei Yap to present his study, his observations with all candor. His bio is attached to the study, and that's impressive, so I won't take up more time reviewing that. And similarly, to get rid of the introductions, not to dismiss them, Sherry Stephenson, longtime student of and teacher of trade policy and how to get from A to B, including on, in particular, on services, investment, digital, and many of the modern issues, will offer her comments as well. Given that we have no second commentator, that buys us extra time for all of you and your collective wisdom to share your own observations, discussion, questions, and so on. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Yap, and thank you for volunteering to do this for us. Over to you.
No, thank you, Jonathan. That's very gracious. I just wanted to give a shout out to Mario and to Sherry as well, and to the distinguished members of the FMG. Just one correction before we begin. Unfortunately, I'm not a doctor, so I hope this is not the point at which you kicked me out. Neither am I an excellency. But thank you very much. And I think what you said is a great way of organizing our thoughts in this short space of time to deal with a really hairy and large issue, sprawling issue that we recognized, the Hinrich Foundation, that we couldn't possibly cover, as you point out, in a single survey. So we sort of shivered it down to 9 questions, which I'll come back to. It's the second issue that you raised. Perhaps I might start with saying that what is the Hinrich Foundation? The Hinrich Foundation is a foundation, it's a philanthropy. It's not a think tank, it's a philanthropy set up with a mission to advance global trade. It's quite simple. There are 2 programs. One is the education program. It funds scholarships related to trade. And the second is the research program, and that's the one that I oversee, with a very, very small team, among which is the great Deborah Elms, who's here as well. It's a small in-house team, but I have quite a large brain trust, I guess, is the word for it, around the world to tap on, particularly when it comes to issues like the WTO they come in very handy, you know, ambassadors, very influential thinkers, Keith Rockwell, and many friends who are in FMG. I should probably very briefly summarize. I assume, you know, that perhaps you know, most of you have read the survey, so I won't go too much into it. I'll discuss it in the context of the three areas that you've raised, Jonathan. And one is the stakeholders. Yes, we did reach out to 27,000, and I think you are right. You're not the first to observe that the WTO lacks an institutional way of reaching out to the broader community. Among the people that we have about 180,000 subscribers. About 60% of them are in policy, but the rest are spread out among businesses. And this is everything from big tech to SMEs to academics. A lot of them very influential people like yourselves. So we do have that capacity. I do have other ideas on where the WTO can go with this, but let me just circle back to that in a little bit. We, as you recognized, didn't have a lot of space. The discussion on the, I want to use the word shortcomings, but it's perhaps a bit pejorative. You know, the indecision at the WTO that has appeared to have grown, you know, not in any way resolved over the last 30 years, was becoming apparent, and we've been having this conversation at the foundation for, you know, I've been there for 3 years for much of it. And we knew what we wanted to do and what we wanted to address. And the question really was how. And it was coinciding with a period of US trade policy that in a way clouded and put in our way a little bit of a stumbling block, because to have raised these issues during a time like this could have come across as spectacularly ham-fisted. So, you know, we thought about, well, how are we going to get around this? And the idea that came up was, well, let's do a survey. You know, we have the people, we'll divide them up, will geographically as well as by sector, and in a sense set our own narrative, you know, aside from the one that was emanating from halfway across the world. So that was what we wanted to do, and we structured it in a way that, as you say, we could not have covered everything, so we had to choose. And there was an argument about, well, how many questions? Some people wanted 5, you know, some people wanted 15. We knew that it couldn't be very long because people are who in this space are very busy. They won't have time for 25 questions. They do not want to spend half an hour on this issue. So we settled on 9, which I think in the end turned out to be a good number. And the way that we structured the survey was to open broadly and then shiver it down, because a survey in itself, you know, in the taking of a survey is a journey in itself. So we recognize that, and there's a regularity to it, from the least negative to the most negative, and it's pretty consistent. So once you start taking the survey, it's a pretty rhythmic exercise, and we opened with the urgency question, which you touched on as well in your opening remarks, and then we funneled it down to decision making and the developing versus developed country status, the dispute settlement mechanism, and most favored nation. And there were a few others as well. These we felt were the most crucial, perhaps the most difficult, certainly the most fundamental. There are many other really important questions that the WTO has to resolve, but if you want to fix the WTO, as people say, I think these are the fundamental questions that we really need to look at. We also wanted to advance the idea of plurilaterals, because really the feeling of the foundation is that, and I think, among many others, is that this is the way forward for a multilateral system that has already fragmented. You need to use the fragments of it that have grown on organically and use them to seed the future evolution of the organization. So very broadly, that was how we did the survey. We had a very hard close of 3 weeks. We stopped it then, and we published the results within a week. The results have been overwhelming in the sense that it showed very clearly among respondents across the board the urgency of doing so. That was very clear, and on virtually all the questions, the response that came back was that those issues needed to be reformed, with the sole exception of most favored nations, which I'll come back to. Some of the other issues that you mentioned, you mentioned the IMF, and I think it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned that the IMF, that the WTO has a institutionalized discussion relationship with the IMF. And I think if we were to sort of go back to, well, how do we do this? Which was the third question that you asked. And I may be jumping the gun here, but I think the Director General has set herself a very ambitious target. I admire her for it. To set the WTO reform as the top of the agenda for MC14, with a package of options for the ministers to choose from, and to really, try and corral a decision out of it. Highly ambitious. She's got her work cut out for her. I don't know if she'll be able to pull it off. She's a highly capable woman, so it's eminently possible. But I think, when you look at the WTO, the first thing that strikes you is that it can't make decisions anymore. That much was clear, both from the survey as well as from just the empirical evidence. So if we were to fix anything, if we were to reform anything, and if we were to put anything before the trade ministers at MC14, this issue, more than any other, needs to be addressed. How do we get unanimity on a plan to give up unanimity? So that is a really fundamental question. I mean, how do you revisit the Marrakesh agreement's provision? This is a question that I suppose could be developed into the Q&A, but I'm just going to throw it out here. I think you need to go back to history and recognize that GATT never actually provided for consensus. It provided for voting. And that came on the heels of a very controversial attempt to create the ITO via the Havana Charter, and a long and fruitless discussion on voting versus weighted voting, the de facto solution to which was GATT. And consensus itself was a de facto solution from a de facto solution. So we need to recognize that. And we need to recognize that at a time like the times that we face today, that flexibility, that broadness of statement of intent needs to be reworked into the structure, I think, of anything that you put before the trade ministers. You know, Hector, who's here, wrote a wonderful article for us in which he proposes a double majority. I think that could be certainly, be profit as one of the options as well. That on its own is going to take a huge amount of debate among members who, would have any amount of recourse to say, well, why 65%? Why 75%? Why not this? Why not that? Why not majority? Why, there's so I think what the WTO needs to do is to return to the spirit of GATT. How did it come about? And it came about as a compromise, because the higher ideal didn't work. And the higher ideal didn't work in part because it was, in a way, if you plumb the history of it, subordinate to what was going on at the IMF. So what we have today, as we discuss this at the WTO, is a GRQ going on at the IMF. And I think that should be kept in sight as we all move forward in an attempt to find a solution. I don't know what the answer is, and I don't envy the people who have to do this. At the Hinrich Foundation, we don't pretend to have the answers. One thing we do know is that there are two ready-made plurilaterals, the e-commerce and the investment facilitation. The e-commerce one presents more of a model, I think, because it is a true plurilateral. It has, I believe, right now about 70 something members. It's lost a number over the past weeks. So it is not even a majority. It is a plurality in the true sense of the word. But in its template, it provides for certain novelties. And if it is to be recognized as a WTO agreement in its own right, as an equal to any other WTO agreement, it has to enter Annex 4. It cannot do this by unanimity. So the solution for it, and it must enter Annex 4. To do so, you have to revisit what are the requirements for a plurilateral to enter Annex 4. Because unanimity is not going to do it. It's a contradiction in terms. So those are the thoughts that I had coming into this discussion. I've probably chewed up quite an amount, probably a bit more time than I should. And I should turn it over to back to you, Jonathan. Oh, you're on mute, I think. You're on mute, I think.
There. Thank you for being succinct. And highlighting two among the 9 plus issues, the question of consensus.
I could go through them all.
No, indeed, and the mechanisms such as Annex 4 as well. That doesn't exclude Sherry, and then you mentioned Hector, who has already written and published on this, and others commenting on any part of the questions raised. So thank you, and let me turn to Sherry for complementing the initial presentation.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'd like to applaud the issue of the Hinrich Foundation to carry out this survey. I think it's very useful. I appreciate the presentation of the results by Chuin Wei. And on the whole, I think the survey results confirm exactly what we've known for a very long time, that the WTO is in dire need of reform. It's a generalized opinion. It's not working well. In many ways, it's been in stasis for a while. It hasn't been able to progress on two of its three main pillars. The first is trade liberalization negotiations, and the second is now dispute settlements as well. So it lacks flexibility to adapt its rules. It hasn't been able to cope with the new trade realities of the digital world, and it can be taken hostage on any issue by just one of its 166 current members. Now, my view is that the problem is not the fault of the WTO, but rather the inadequacy of the system within which the WTO functions. It's the system that needs rethinking and reform. The WTO as an organization, we all know, is the result of history. Chuin Wei went back again to the GATT and the origins of the GATT and how consensus, compromise was necessary and a default solution on many important issues, including consensus. The WTO inherited the GATT's way of functioning, its operations. It's the result of history, and it is now the product of the behavior, attitudes, and rules put together by its members as a result of this history. The GATT was a much smaller organization. We all know that. It was a gentleman's club in many ways. It operated in a congenial problem-solving manner. And it was much easier at the time because its members were like-minded countries at similar levels of development. Now, this is clearly no longer the case. This context has changed dramatically with the transformation into the WTO, and following its transformation, a significant increase in membership, as well as in the number of issues before the organization. But, and this is the important but, these changes have not been accompanied by a change in the way the organization operates. And the operational structure that the WTO inherited has not proved up to the task. So this leads us to the question of whether the system within which the WTO operates can be reformed independently of the organization itself. In my mind, this is a key question. The WTO lacks a board of governors like the IMF and the World Bank, as well as an executive board or boards to carry out everyday tasks. The WTO does not vote on issues. Although voting is allowed, it was never put into practice. And we know how important this is in an increasingly diverse membership. The WTO lacks a means to approve budgetary increases in a timely manner. And the rules adopted by the WTO and the practices it follows do not give it the flexibility to adapt to change, both institutional and topical. And then there's the issue of non-market economies trying to fit into a system of rules that was designed for market-based economies. So this is quite a litany of serious issues, and if one could take the WTO's temperature, it would surely be seen as having a high fever with no aspirin or Tylenol in sight. So back to the survey. I'd like to comment on a couple of points that Jonathan made in his opening remarks to frame our discussion today, and which Chuin Wei followed up upon. First, the breadth of the survey is very impressive. Having obtained over 27,000 responses and respondents from 5 geographical areas, that's absolutely remarkable. So we can be fairly certain that the opinions it reflects are representative and widely held across the global economy. This lends credibility to the survey results and the need to take them seriously. It also underscores that this overdue process has now become urgent if the WTO is to remain relevant as the third Bretton Woods post-war institution, the one responsible for international trade relations. Many of the results in the survey we suspected already, but they have importantly been confirmed. An overwhelmingly percentage of respondents feel that the WTO at present has serious problems in the following areas. The first and foremost one, and which was emphasized by Chuin Wei, is practice of consensus for decision-making, which many feel is the most serious issue impeding the WTO from making forward progress. Secondly, the absence of a fully functioning dispute settlement mechanism or process. Thirdly, the lack of a definition of what is a developing country WTO member, and therefore how special and differential treatment should be applied. And in this context, I'd like to note that the World Bank and the IMF also deal with development issues and or make loans to developing countries. They both have definitions of developing countries and categories of developing countries. The WTO does not. Fourthly, the rigid application of the MFN principle. And fifthly, the need to update WTO rules to adapt to new trade realities such as e-commerce, digital trade, investment, environmental issues, and other. Now, additionally, in my view, there are 3 questions that the survey did not ask, which I think are key and which would have been included in my wish list, and Jonathan had others. These are, firstly, can the WTO be reformed in its current state, or will it be necessary to rethink the WTO in the context of a new organization? Second, to what extent has the absence of a board and a strong executive function contributed to the WTO's inability to move forward on its key mandates? And thirdly, can WTO rules conceived to deal with market economies be adapted to effectively cover and discipline the practices of mixed or non-market economies? I also would have liked to see a question on the ranking of priority among the issues that the survey covered. But since we do not know what the answers to these questions would have been, it's impossible to comment upon the respondents' views. However, they are questions that will have to be answered as we move forward in the reform discussions. As Jonathan mentioned as well, the survey likewise does not address the question of how WTO reform should be carried out. Of course, that's rather difficult to do in a very short survey questions, almost impossible, but it is a critical aspect of this whole topic. More than 82% of the respondents said that the WTO needed reform, but what we need to do now is find out more about what this reform should be and what it should contain. In my view, this is sort of like the parable of the blind man or women and the elephant. Each person examines one part of an elephant, and each one comes to a different conclusion as to what an elephant is. They're all partly right, but also all entirely wrong, as they cannot see the elephant comprehensively. So the call for WTO reform seems to me a little like examining the elephant. Everyone knows that it's a big object, but each one has a different perspective or point of view on it. In a similar fashion, many knowledgeable people and experts have put forward different proposals for WTO reform, including many during the sessions that the FMG has organized to discuss this topic, with emphasis on one aspect or another. Many assign blame to the consensus practice, others to the lack of leadership. Others point to the lack of a definition on what is a developing country and therefore who qualifies for S&D treatment. Others to the absence of being able to settle disputes and thus a lack of confidence in the application of trade rules, and so on. Each one is valid on its own, but a full and lasting package of reforms will need to be comprehensive to be effective. So the current Director General of the WTO is called for comprehensive reform, as Chuin Wei said, very ambitious. And this to take place or be prepared before MC14 next March. But no action or little action so far towards this seems to be underway. She specifically proposed to convene an independent panel of eminent persons to start off the discussion of this reform process. However, her proposal was opposed by one member of the WTO General Council at its meeting last February and thus not approved. The WTO continues, therefore, in a state of stasis, even as the world of trade becomes increasingly complex with the present shift towards unilateralism and away from multilateralism by the United States. The answers to the survey do not provide us with any clues for these blind men and women, but they do provide evidence and justification for the efforts that will be necessary to undertake the reform task. So in my mind, the survey is very important, but must be seen as a first step in a long process, perhaps similar to the process that established the GATT or that transformed the GATT into the WTO. At this point, a transformational exercise is needed. We know the questions it must address, but we still need to define how to go about it, what the reform should contain, and in what form they should be codified. We also need to identify who will initiate and lead this process. So here, maybe I can just say a few more words, since I'm the only commentator today, drawing from the previous FMG sessions that have discussed WTO reform. As we all know, we're currently in a very difficult situation of geopolitical tension and growing polarization. WTO rules have been flagrantly broken and ignored by one of the major trading partners, and others are trying to decide how to cope with constant change and the onslaught of discrimination. There's felt to be a void of leadership at present in the trading system, which is not being filled from within or by the G20. Many valuable ideas and proposals have been put forward by FMG members in the form of books, papers, or blogs over the past weeks and months as the question of WTO and systemic reform has come to the forefront, starting perhaps with Alan Wolf's volume in 2023 on revitalizing the world trading system and carrying forward today with several blogs, the most recent one by Hector Torres, which hopefully he'll comment on. Opinions have been expressed by FMG members in the previous sessions held by the group dedicated to discussion of the reform topic. Some FMG experts believe that the WTO can do little in the current situation of disregard for the MFN principle by the United States and the lack of a functioning dispute settlement system. However, they emphasize the importance for the remaining WTO members to continue to adhere to the rules and express their belief in the importance of a non-discriminatory, stable, and predictable multilateral trading system. They also consider that it's very important to reiterate publicly the support for the WTO and the rules-based trading system, and to highlight the benefits that it has brought to its members and the world economy. Their emphasis is to hold tight for the present until the future may bring better days. Several FMG experts feel that it is important to start discussions now, but not within the WTO, as these will go nowhere. The suggestion of initiating reform talks outside of the WTO, jointly by the EU and the CPTPP members, has been floated by several. Some FMG experts feel that reform discussions, proposals, and action can take place within the WTO at the appropriate moment, perhaps after a change of US administration in 4 years' time, depending upon how the political situation evolves. However, others feel that it might be preferable and more fruitful to think of constructing an entirely new organization that would replace the WTO, would contain updated rules, a more effective organizational system, and greater flexibility in its operation. This would involve starting over again and designing the system among like-minded countries, although the composition of these would be very different from what it was previously. I would caution that before heading down this path, a serious evaluation should be undertaken of the benefits and costs of starting over in a new context. Would reform without some major trading partners be lasting? And would this effectively convert the WTO into a big plurilateral trade agreement instead of a multilateral institution? So to conclude, we are still very much like the blind people, all groping for part of a solution to add to the whole picture of WTO reform. How this will be done, in what manner, and over what period of time are questions the survey did not or could not deal with, but are critical. They're also beyond my ability to see into the future. But what is certain is that we need to think seriously about them, start taking action to discuss them, and initiatives in the appropriate places to move them forward. Or we will be left without the effective third leg of our Bretton Woods system. So thank you again to the Hinrich Foundation for this survey, which gave us not only such useful results, but also prompted these reflections and today's discussions. Over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Sherry, thank you for your very thoughtful remarks. Chuin Wei, we'll take a series of comments and observations, and maybe you can accumulate your notes to comment in response. I won't try and summarize the two presentations so far, but certain themes are beginning to emerge as of particular interest and focus. Hector, you've been pointed to by both the presenter and the commentator, and you volunteered, I see in the chat, and I'll highlight two others, that you've drawn attention to an article on some inspirational approaches to building consensus, so people may want to bookmark that and read that later. But Hector, sorry to put you on the spot, but I hope you'll take up the challenge. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting. Yeah, well, I will start by quoting Chuin Wei, who put it very clearly: how to reach unanimity to do without unanimity. And that's a very hard question. I sent just in a chat something that you may want to explore. It was used during the Paris Conference on Climate Change. And I would suggest that it would be good to invite those that used it, meaning the French basically, that hosted the conference, to tell us how it worked. It's curiously a South African Zulu method to crack differences that could not be narrowed with normal forms. And it is called Indaba. You can check that website. It described how they did it. But it would be very good to invite them, I think, for a future meeting and say how they actually used it. It's basically it's consensus. There's no way to get out from consensus understood as unanimity if you understand it as a right with no boundaries, with no limitations. You can just block and gain some leverage for the next negotiation without any obligation. Well, at the Paris conference, they use this, and there is an obligation, which is to table proposals that are trying to reach common ground. Of course, everything depends on good faith, but in any case, I think we should look at this carefully. It worked, at least. Then I would say that Sherry raised a very important point. Up to what point the WTO is blocked because we don't have a board or a steering committee. And I think that that's a very good question. Time ago, in the old GATT, there was no steering committee or board, but there was a green room. Green room were meetings of limited number of countries, representative countries, but limited number, where people worked out agreements, they explored interest more than positions. And eventually, collegial spirit, collegial interest prevailed. They stitched some agreements and they tried to market that agreement to the rest of the membership. As you know very well, those that were not invited at the green room complained. But it worked. Now, I wouldn't go back to green rooms, but I think that what Sherry mentioned about having, maybe a facilitator or a steering committee or something of the sort to really start discussing about what needs to be changed, definitely, if we want to have this organization to work. And of course, I don't ignore that in the current situation in which we have so little trust, it's very difficult to imagine that we will have an agreement, we will reach an agreement on substance. But we could reach an agreement on process. And reaching an agreement on process, even without dealing with substance, could start building up the little bit of trust that could kickstart a process that could eventually agree on substantive reforms. I think that would be my suggestion. Then the IMF was mentioned. And I think that that's something that, of course, you're very familiar, Jonathan. I had the chance of sharing the board at the IMF with you sometime. And there is some parallelism, some, I would say, some dysfunctional situations on both sides of the Atlantic that I believe exceed, of course, the WTO and exceed the IMF, but they are related. The point is that I remember when I went to the board for the first time, I was coming from the staff from the WTO, and suddenly I land there and I find that the same countries, the same big emerging market countries that I heard so loudly at the WTO complaining that they were not ready to give up special and differential treatment because they were developing. And therefore, they were not in a position to assume full trade responsibilities. They needed special and differential treatment. These same countries, of course, different phases, at the IMF were arguing exactly the opposite. We have outgrown our IMF quotas. Our relative weight in the world economy is equal to or even bigger than all those other countries that at the WTO were called developed and at the IMF were called advanced. And at the IMF, they argued strongly, we deserve larger quotas because we want to assume full financial responsibilities, which are, I would say, compatible with our real weight in the world economy. And you could hear this thing coming from, he said the trade minister don't speak with the finance minister. It cannot be that they argue the same thing, the opposite thing on both sides of the Atlantic. So my question is, of course, it's very difficult to imagine that in this current geopolitical fracture, you would get the United States and the EU, which are the most, of course, have more weight at the world economy, at the IMF, agreeing to increase China's, India's, Brazil's, let alone Russia, which I don't believe is the case here, but Indonesia, giving more weight there just for nothing. And I even agree, I even think it would be very hard, but at least at the G20, somebody has to say this has to come straight. This has to be a process in which there is an agreement that we have to move on both sides of the Atlantic in one single sense. I mean, those countries that are large emerging markets sitting at the G20 cannot be sitting at the steering group and at the same time arguing that they need different rules to prosper. And let me say one word here on prosper. It's not about the rules. I mean, many countries have prospered with this set of rules. So the problem is not the set of rules. The problem is domestic policies, domestic circumstances, if you want. So, I think that these two things, decision-making and S&D, are two things we need to crack. We need to reform the WTO or create a new organization. It cannot work with these two things because it just doesn't make sense. I stop here.
Hector, thank you. Insightful and provocative as always. Let me offer one recollection and try and group what we've heard so far so that we can take things forward. When I chaired the General Council, I too highlighted, including at the council meeting, that unlike virtually every other international organization, that has, on corporate analogy, shareholders' meetings, such as the general councils or ministerials, and a board of directors, the IMF, International Monetary and Finance Committee, the Security Council, alongside the General Assembly. There's nothing like that at the WTO. And Mario will recall, I tried to convene on a regular basis the chairs of each council and the 13 committees as an ad hoc steering committee so that committee agendas were aligned, so that the members themselves were not totally subservient to the secretariat setting all the agendas, and so on. It didn't gain enough traction. The members themselves weren't interested, and unlike these other organizations where there's a readiness to delegate to a smaller group of members, like the International Monetary and Finance Committee, the authority to act on behalf of everyone else, trade ministers and their ambassadors are much more protective of each and every one having a say all the way along. So it's not as if the idea of an executive board or steering committee is new. There just hasn't been appetite. All right, let me say that what I heard so far revolves around three pillars: decision making, both in terms of consensus, double consensus, in effect, plurilateral versus multilateral within the multilateral system, the Article 4, the Annex 4 issue that Chuin Wei raised as one group of issues. The second set of issues that I heard was how to approach reform. And really, there's two, I won't say competing or complementary, maybe both approaches. One, which Sherry highlighted, is we need it to be comprehensive because there are so many issues, and the history is always one of trade-offs and overall balancing. The other is to build on incrementally areas where there can be some success, whether it's e-commerce, investment facilitation, building on the trade facilitation agreement example, to build out by way of building blocks increased confidence. And then the third dimension of that is on-site versus off-site. The EU has officially endorsed, as has the CPTPP membership at their meeting, a willingness to have a dialogue. My own view is that's great, but totally incomplete, as it doesn't include enough of the least developed. It doesn't include African representation, which is what the Ottawa group was meant to fill in. Tim Grosser may wish to comment on this. So there's still the question of the how. Then finally, for Chuin Wei, for Sherry, for all of you, Adam Jakobic has put some good questions in the chat or in the Q&A regarding the current U.S. administration views, because he highlights that although we glibly say the Americans have turned their back on the WTO, he highlights a couple of examples where there's some hint of turning to the rule book by the United States itself, including in its negotiations. I'm going to stop there, turn to Alan, invite others to raise their hands now. We have about a half hour or a little more. to put the issues on the table. Adam, you may wish to speak to your questions as well, and we'll carry on from there. Alan, please.
Hi, thank you very much. An illuminating discussion as always at the FMG, and highly appreciated. While Lou is away, I appreciate Mario and others rising to the challenge of organizing all of this, and Sherry's comments, and Jonathan, yours, and Hector's insights. Just assume, at least I do, the U.S. position is, whether stated formally or not, there is to be no discussion at the WTO on reform, period. So we can say, well, wouldn't it be good to have at Cameroon a lovely coming together of something or other? That's not in the cards currently. Countries are very wary of the United States, and they're engaging in bilateral discussions or seeking to avoid them. Whatever their position is, the world is being dominated by one thing, which is the U.S. position bilaterally. So we can theorize about some discussion at the WTO, not going to happen as long as it is accepted that one member or one important member can veto any discussions at the WTO. So I just put out that notion that whatever thinking takes place about the future of the international trading system, one in which the U.S. might rejoin, because the U.S. is clearly outside it now in terms of its behavior. Only with respect to Articles 1, 2, and 3, however, of the GATT, they have not yet discovered some of the other articles to be at variance with. So that's just a note of not despair, but just to say the activity is going to take place someplace else, unless someone says from the chair at some point, I can't hear you. Your objection, I just can't hear your objection. One general counsel chair came up with this idea that somehow a new director general had been chosen by consensus, Ngozi. And now it took a change of administration in the United States for that to be formalized. But it was someone conducting a process who said, I can't hear you, to a recalcitrant. And usually that recalcitrant had somewhat an Indian accent, but we have now an American twang to that recalcitrant. Anyway, good luck, WTO.
You're on mute, Jonathan.
Alan, a very sobering reality check that's important for us to factor into the rest of our discussion and our advice to our colleagues in each of our capitals as we go forward. Chuin Wei, you want to jump in now?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to Ambassador Wolf and Sherry as well, who did a much better job at summarizing the survey than I did. I just wanted to make a couple of comments, observations, and take the liberty of offering some recommendations and thoughts. The comprehensiveness of the issues that Sherry references, absolutely. The reform process has to be absolutely comprehensive, but it is a process, and I think you correctly recognize that as well. And if I were to recommend, if I were to sort of architect this, I would say don't go for everything. You will lose, and you will fail. So you go for where the weaknesses are, and the weaknesses, Ambassador Wolf, you mentioned 1, 2, and 3, but I would say it's 9. Go for Article 9, because in Article 9, you have the enshrinement of the practice of consensus as followed by GATT. Now, this is incorrect because if you look at GATT, it provides for voting. So I don't know how many lawyers there are in this room, but I would get the help on this because the translation of GATT 25 into Marrakesh 9 was a conflation. And if you return to the spirit of GATT, it turned to consensus because there were 23 members. And it was an easier way to get done. Hector refers to it as the green room process. Yeah, that was the spirit of the time. You have 166 members now, and you can't get, consensus done. So GATT provides for voting. Whether or not voting becomes the successful way forward, we come back to the point that I made about the necessary parallel to the IMF, because the ITO was being negotiated at the same time as the IMF. And the reason the ITO fell apart was because of the sovereignty issue. The US needs to know that it retains a certain amount of sovereignty in the issue. And if you ignore that at your peril. And you cannot have a WTO. In 2001, a good friend of mine who's a writer, and he very eloquently said that upon China's accession to the WTO, it really put the W in the WTO. Now, having recognized everything that's happened in the last 6 months, we would still say that the US being in the WTO puts the W in the WTO as well. So it seems to me that non-market economy, yes, is an important issue. It needs to be in the comprehensive reform that eventually evolves. The first thing that the non-market economy has to do is to step up to be recognized as a developed country. There is no option, because if you don't graduate to that status, you don't have the status to lead. So that requirement, regardless of the other reforms that take place for the non-market economy, that is the first and most important prerequisite for that non-market economy to participate in the leadership of this organization. Now, we go back to where the weakness is. The weakness is in stating that the practice of consensus is the way to make decisions at the WTO, as followed by GATT. Now, this needs to be revisited because it was an interpretation that has turned out to be impractical and potentially incorrect. So I would say we need to focus on just a handful of issues to move this forward. Don't try to move the whole thing with all the 100, whatever it is, innumerable points of contention together. You will never make it. Just focus on a handful. And Adam asks a really good question, which addresses how the US views e-commerce. And if you view the history of the US participation in the e-commerce plurilateral, you will notice a few things. Even as he was gutting the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, Bob Lighthizer made sure that the US kept a seat at the e-commerce plurilateral. And it kept a seat, the US kept a seat all the way through until the JSI was announced, the stabilized text, end of April last year. The US dropped out. Now, the US dropped out not because it doesn't want to be there, but it dropped out because it was an election year, and it was just unbecoming to be sort of seen like aboard this agreement alongside China in a WTO agreement in an election year. I mean, there were a number of dynamics going on, but recognize this as well. When the e-commerce JSI went to General Council to be put into Annex 4, there were a number of countries that objected, and that killed it. It was a given. Nobody was surprised. What was a surprise, perhaps, was that the US was not among them. So the US was agreeable to let it enter Annex 4. It was the predictable others, India, South Africa, Indonesia, who didn't allow the e-commerce JSI to be put into Annex 4. The hints, the signals that we have seen and that Adam rightly references indicates that the e-commerce JSI remains, as frail as it is, the only possible opening in which to draw the US back into this conversation. And I would say that you can do this without the US if you want. Equally, you could do it without China if you want. But as you know, I'd like to quote Deng Xiaoping here. He said this of the World Bank, that we could do this alone if we had to, but we think it's easier and better if we do it with you. And sort of turn it around and say that it would be easier. I mean, we could do this alone, but it would be a weaker WTO if you do not have either the US or the China in it. The question of the steering committee is something that obviously would help a lot. If we got at something like that, it would clearly be of help. I'm not entirely sure that it has helped the tensions at the IMF GRQ, the 17th GRQ so far. Again, ultimately, it boils down to a question of, and dare I say this in such august company, of brute power. That discussion is about sovereignty. And whatever solution emerges from this, we have to recognize that making a concession to the worries about sovereignty in the decisive economies has to be a flexibility that the WTO would need to grow. I've probably rambled on a bit too much, but I hope these were responses that are resonant with you.
Thanks very much. We have 3 people with hands raised, but let me preface that with, again, some very quick observations. Hector already highlighted, Brad, whose hand is raised, may wish to add to this. Look, the consensus and the implicit veto, whether by India, China, or the United States at the General Council, is paralleled by the weighted voting rules at the IMF, in effect, with 85% majority required. Those who hold 16%, like the United States or the EU collectively, have a veto and prevent a consensus decision from being made. So the realities of power and sovereignty pervade the international system, not to mention the Security Council veto. Second, so that we not repeat it here, those who haven't been with us for a while, with Hamid, Sherry, and others, we've had pretty exhaustive discussions on plurilaterals within the multilateral framework, and the reality that any group of countries is perfectly free to get together to talk about approaches among themselves. The real test becomes at the end, and we come back to Chuin Wei's observations about Annex 4, that there are ways to build in plurilaterals into a multilateral framework rather than having to depart the multilateral system. So just some quick observations. Let me go in reverse order here and turn to Brad, then Hector, then back to Sherry, by which time Chuin Wei will probably turn to you for summarizing everything into the path forward that will define the world. So, Brad first.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan, and hello, everyone. I just wanted to make a quick couple of observations on IMF voting, since that comes up here in a few times, and I think while it's always going to be the case that different institutions, because they have different missions, are going to need different organizational approaches, including in voting, I do think that the way the IMF votes can give us something to talk about here. And so the 2 points I wanted to make was, first, that it was not always the case that voting in the IMF was really accepted. 3 or 4 years ago, when researching a paper that I did for Petros's class at Columbia, I came across an internal IMF memo from the United States executive director imploring his colleagues on the IMF executive board to use the voting procedures that were there in the Articles of Agreement. And I think there may be a lesson there in that it really took, in the IMF case, it took someone or someone's pointing this out and stressing and actually calling for votes sometimes to get members at that time to actually begin to use those procedures that were, as in the current WTO, already there on paper. So I don't know, maybe there's a just do it analogy here in some sense. So the second point I wanted to make is something that Jonathan was just sort of referring to as well. It's just that there is this tiered voting in the IMF, from simple majorities to, for some sorts of issues, to an 85% voting share requirement on certain things. And I think the fact that, to me, there can be a lesson there. So maybe it's the case that inside the WTO, there are some things for which maybe a simple majority or some qualified majority may be appropriate, and other things for which it may remain the case that a consensus is the way to go forward. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, Hector. And Alan, I'm going to put you on notice, if I could, or any other American, to take another look at Adam's questions. Are there enough hints that he's cited of the administration buying into some of the rules that represent some engagement or not? That's maybe a simple yes or no. Hector.
Thank you very much. And I'll start by acknowledging that Alan raised a very sour but real question. Now, this means that we need at least two elements to make whatever reform has to be palatable for Washington. And I believe with two elements, we could work that out. The first would be something that you hinted and Brad just mentioned, is we could introduce a double majority, provided that it is designed in such a way that beyond the headcount, the majority of headcount, which you could put at whatever level you want, you need the participation of countries representing a significant share of global trade. And in that significant share of global trade, I believe that the US, China, and the EU would need to have effective capacity to retain a veto power on major decisions. If we could design something of this kind, I think we could be working with reality. The second is something that nobody would be surprised. To frame a reform, we have to frame a reform narrative in a way that it aligns with the US domestic politics. This means that whatever we work out, President Trump will be, or should be, able to present it as a success, a strategic success, rather than a concession. That could always be worked out. I know it's not very funny for others, but it's a fact of life. So those two things, I think, could allow us to work out a double majority, retaining veto power for the three big countries, or group of countries in the case of the EU, and the capacity for the government of the US to claim victory. Thank you.
Sherry.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to everyone for these thoughtful interventions and comments and questions. This is not easy. Let me start with Jonathan's comments on how to approach reform. Yes, obviously, comprehensive is critical, but comprehensive doesn't have to mean everything is done all at once. That's a very tall task and almost impossible. Clearly, you need a comprehensive outcome, but you can build towards it incrementally, obviously in agreement. You have to create confidence along the way, but just say that we have tried this in the WTO. The WTO has tried this. There have been 2 successful plurilateral initiatives that have concluded in outcomes, and the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement has been for a long time. The e-commerce JSI has been waiting for a year. Both have been blocked by different reasons, different parties. So this suggests that, yes, the flexibility is there, but 2, if the use of the flexibility option brings us to the same outcome, which is that the WTO cannot move forward because it's being blocked by the consensus, quote unquote, principle, which is, incorrectly been interpreted that way. Practice is more like it, as Chuin Wei very eloquently explained. Then I agree with Chuin Wei. Let's look first and foremost at what is the main thing blocking. Can we get any incremental progress on discussing the reform of this consensus practice? Can we get an agreement that this will be looked at? Can we get an agreement that the process, as Hector said, maybe we can reach agreement on the process first, if not on the substance, so we can start moving forward, at least to discuss things. Well, I think this time between now and MC14 will tell us a lot. Living in the United States is a very different reality from living elsewhere at this point in time and history. It's very sobering. Alan's perspective is entirely realistic. This won't be easy. So I think if we can see if there could be a possibility of getting an agreement just on process to start a reform discussion on perhaps the first and main priority, which is looking at the practice of consensus, and we can get that by MC14, that's positive. I'm not going to say whether I believe it's possible or not. I have serious doubts. I think Alan's observation that under this current administration, the US is allergic to the WTO. It does not care if it's successful. It doesn't give any priority, and it does not care if it breaks the rules, and it fundamentally does not care. This is a problem. This is a huge issue, but maybe I'm wrong. I hope so. If we could get agreement on a process decision at MC14, then we could at least begin discussions within the WTO. That's positive. I don't know if they'll be prosperous, but that's positive. Then that will tell us something. If we can't get that by next March, that tells us a lot. That tells us that this may not be the best way to go about things at this point, and certainly not at this point in time and for the next 3 years. And then it would be even more important to look at the option of building on the EU TPP discussions, but as Jonathan mentioned, broadening them, maybe more to an Ottawa group format. And in this context, it would be worthwhile, not maybe right now, but after next March, if this doesn't prosper, asking if Canada can try leading this again. Don't. Do not laugh, Jonathan. This is serious. You have
I appreciate that. It's early in the mandate of the new government. We'll see what happens at the G7.
Exactly. And
We
that's
have-
very important. So anyway,
So-
those are my thoughts. I think this might be incremental steps going towards MC14, and then we can reevaluate as of next year. But thanks. That's what I'd like to say.
Thanks. We have two more interveners. We have 10 minutes left. So between John Weeks and Alan Wolf, and giving Chuin Wei the right of response to everything, let's try and keep it concise. John, you have a unique perspective as the only former chair of the contracting parties in the GATT and chair of the General Council in the WTO for decision making in each body. And then we'll turn to Alan before going back to Chuin Wei. John.
Thank you, John. Let me thank all the participants so far. I think this has been an extraordinarily rich discussion, and one that clearly we should continue forward. I suspect there's more room to continue this forward, perhaps focusing on some of these issues one at a time in the context of FMG. But clearly, I think it has to be carried forward in a broader context with leaders from governments involved. And I suspect it's not possible to carry out this discussion right now in the WTO itself. So we have to find some other way of doing that. And in the interest of time, I won't say anything more about that right now. I found two things particularly interesting out of a rich menu of things that were very interesting. And that is, one is the comment made by Hector about when he got to the IMF board and found out that the representatives of certain countries were saying things that were quite different in the WTO and in the IMF. And I think we need to figure out a way to deal with that. Perhaps, obviously, one way might be to look at it in a G20 type context, or to pick up, the Tim Grosser idea that there be a heads of government meeting of the EU and TPP countries to sort of start this process moving. Clearly, by going to the head of government level, you presumably get around that issue somewhat. The other is about consensus. And I must say, I've thought about this a lot, and I've always come to the conclusion that consensus is very difficult to get rid of, because essentially the WTO is a negotiating forum. You're asking countries to make commitments that are going to that will require legislative changes in their domestic jurisdictions. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that that parliaments are going to vote in favor of something if the government is opposed to it, or if there's a broad national consensus to oppose something in a country. But I don't think that precludes reform of the consensus principle. But maybe we need to look at how do we safeguard, for instance, the right of each country in the final analysis to determine what it will accept in a negotiation. Maybe there's room to explore that. Some people said, well, we would get rid of consensus for procedural decisions, but then that sort of baits a question of what is a procedural decision. Maybe the other way to look at it would be to say, what do we really need to safeguard? Why is the consensus principle retained support for so long? I'll stop there. Thank you. Excellently chaired discussion too, sir.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. Do recall, colleagues, that there is a paper and there is some discussion of quote unquote responsible consensus as a further understanding and elaboration. Alan, I know your time is limited. We've caught you just in time, so please.
Yeah, just to say, when I said, the U.S. is where the U.S. is, which is it really, really, really doesn't want the WTO to be doing anything, and because it's dangerous. The whole idea of the WTO is to circumscribe national behavior, and the U.S. doesn't want its national behavior circumscribed. So what's to be done? It seems to me if we had a general council meeting during COVID, one good general council meeting, no follow-up, of course, in which there was to be, we're just going to have a single issue on the agenda, and that is, what are you seeing? What's your view of what the problems are you are facing as a government with respect to COVID? And there was a single conversation. It was very illuminating. There was no political argumentation. It was helpful and could have been carried forward, but it wasn't. There's nothing to stop a general council chair, I would think, from saying, like to hear further from members on X. And they hear further. And all of a sudden, there's a discussion on whether it's the consensus rule or something else. Or it could be, if you want to intrigue the United States, let's talk about preserving sovereignty. Add some spice. And the U.S. or say, we're going to talk about how dispute settlement went wrong or something like that. And the U.S. is going to raise its flag and say, I'm against that. I don't want to hear about it. No. So there are ways forward in terms of within the WTO, and a lot of good discussion about what could happen outside the WTO. My apologies, I am going to have to leave shortly.
Now, thank you. And I want to thank Adam, who didn't come out of the woodwork, but his question is provocative. The U.S. is engaged or hinting around some of the rules at the margin. I'd add one other element to that. A very interesting statement by the U.S. representative at the FAO, where they called for the FAO to stick to its core mandate, which says the U.S. actually believes in the SPS code of rules to preserve its self-interests in agricultural trade. So there's little bits and pieces around there. Chuin Wei, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 50 seconds to leave Mario the last
It's
word.
not very fair, John.
Obviously, a
But
foundation for further discussion. So
yeah,
please, back to
thank
you
you.
for the
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say I don't speak for the foundation. I'm just thinking out loud for myself. And there are a number of really interesting issues. Obviously, Alan, raised that the U.S. would almost certainly object to any realistic reform. So we have to go back to the structure of how decisions are made, and I've put forward, the interpretation that Marrakesh 9 was incorrectly built on GATT 25. GATT gave each member a vote. It has to be for something. You have that vote for something. So at some point, it may have to be used. Now, Hector has put forward, the double majority proposal, which I think is a good one. And this, the answer that I have to that gels with what John Weeks, brought up, which is plurilaterals. John was talking about how, consensus has just, you can't do without it because it means legislation. And because of that, you can't force any country to go along with an agreement that they simply are not going to legislate. So we go back to the idea that the answer lies in plurilaterals. That is the organic driving force now of the changing times, unprecedented times. And to get around this stumbling block of governments that do not want to legislate agreements that they do not participate in, the answer is simply, well, you don't have to be part of the deal. I mean, we have a structure in which we have a subset of deals, but you don't have to be a part of it. And plurilaterals, therefore, have to be the force around which you rally around. And when we talk about a double majority, what we really want to incorporate, I would propose to refine what Hector is proposing, is the idea of hardwiring plurality into it. So it is not a double majority. It is a plurality plus majority, or a double plurality, even if you want it. But what I'm saying is you have a plurality of numbers plus a majority of share of trade. Now, what that share of trade is an interesting question, because that same balance between our two largest economies as share of trade reflects the 15% bright line in the IMF. You know, it's the same dynamic that is going on. So where you set that share of trade is going to be enormously contentious if you were to push forward this double plurality or plurality plus majority rule. But if I were to, propose anything, if I were to recommend anything, it would be to put plurality at the heart of a system in which voting, at least for the time being, again, is used, because it strikes me that we are living in a time that is unusual, and we would like to do things, I think, ideally by consensus, but GATT was formed with every member having a vote, and it's being wasted. It's not in the spirit of the creation of the general agreement. And I think we need, in a time like this, when we say that we want to defend the multilateral trading system, to ask ourselves, what is it about the multilateral trading system that we want to defend, that we are defending? And the answer is that it is its values. And in its values lie this idea that each member has a vote. So, that's I suppose how I'm going to close. I haven't even begun to sort of scratch the surface of what everyone has brought up. I mean, one of which is EU CPTPP, which I think, ultimately that may be a parallel track. But at the WTO, there has to be movement. And for there to be movement, there has to be an economy of where we make progress. And even as Sherry sort of alludes to, if it is on one single and clarion issue, I think we need to decide what it is. And I think it's pretty obvious after this discussion where it lies.
Well, thank you. I had a feeling we were going to fill, if not want, more time. It's interesting that we gravitated towards the process of decision-making and agreement rather than the several substantive areas and rule book, dispute settlement, and so on that were identified as key to reform. Mario, this suggests that in consultation with Lou, you've got a rich agenda for future sessions. I don't think the FMG will declare itself as the executive board on behalf of all members, but we're not badly unrepresentative of the broader community. I want to thank Chuin Wei, Sherry, Hector, and others for their value, John Weeks and their others for their interventions, Adam for your provocative question, and back to you, Mario, to close the proceedings.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all. Good speaker, good discussion, and really it has been, as usual, I would say, an illuminating discussion, because it's a lot fruit for thought. And definitely, I want to talk to Lou for this idea to continue discussing this issue. One single fact on the issue of voting from Chuin Wei, in GATT times, was the number of members were 23. So to vote whether 23 or 166 is rather different. But this is for the next discussion. Thank you for this opportunity and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.